Marxism Lesson 3, The Commodity. In Lesson 2, we identified what capital is. We viewed what hypothetically occurs in an abstract and ideal capitalist situation. Commodities go in, people get paid, profit gets made, but in reality, the process is a lot more complex than that. What is the nature of the stuff which we use as capital? Why do we choose certain things to be capital, and why does it have value? These commodities are essentially anything which meets human needs, which are external to ourselves. They must have what Marx calls a use value. You cannot quantify use value, you can only determine whether it exists in the item in question. However, it has an exchange value, that is, the quantity of commodities it can be exchanged for. For example, I can exchange 20 bushels of corn for 2 pounds of iron, and I can exchange 2 pounds of iron for 1 coat. Therefore, 20 bushels of corn also can be exchanged for 1 coat. These all are of equivalent exchange value. Of course, these are all quantitative representations of value. Value is the connector. These are all equivalent because of a force called value. What then is value? If we search around, these are not all of equivalent utility, for that is subjective. They also are not of equivalent risk value or some abstract notion. The only thing they have in common is labor. Labor alone is so variable that we worry there may be no common denominator at all. But, if we find the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production, normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society, then we find that the denominator would be such a socially necessary labor time. Therefore, the value of a commodity does not stay constant as it advances or it varies in labor productivity. And if you make a mud pie which no one wants, then the low use value will cause its exchange value to decrease. That is why specialized commodities which are rare, but very useful, are very expensive. And if only you have use for it, then it has a high personal utility, but low social utility. Therefore use value is social use value, and not pure subjective utility. Social use value is only the activator of exchange value, and is not directly equivalent to the exchange value which is determined by socially necessary labor time. They are all clearly connected, but social use value is not quantifiable, and therefore we cannot draw perfect equivalence between it, labor time, and exchange value. Marx argued that the socially necessary labor time which goes into commodity production is in fact embodied in the commodities themselves. Therefore, if the socially necessary labor time which goes into production of a commodity decreases, then there is a direct correlation with its exchange value. For example, 20 yards of cloth take 5 minutes to weave and are worth $2, and when one takes that cloth and in 10 minutes makes 20 yards of linen, then the same length in linen is worth $4. Remember, these are in socially necessary labor times, and thus averaged out amongst all examples in this society's market. And since it takes 10 minutes to make a shirt using the same materials and tools, it also costs $4. There are only 2 types of commodity: natural commodities and value commodities. One is free, like air or water, and the other has value, because we utilize human labor to transform nature. Once someone puts labor into a raw material and makes it into a value commodity, then society deems it reasonable to exchange their value commodities for that value commodity. The exchange value of a commodity is only realized in relation to others, but not itself. To itself it is worth nothing. Only in relation to commodities of equivalent value does it itself have value. They are of the same value because they have the same amount of embodied socially necessary labor time. Not only can the wheat be compared to the coat, but to all other commodities. We can expand the form of value infinitely. This is called the total or expanded form of value. X commodity A equals Y commodity B equals Z commodity C equals Q commodity D, etc., where the lowercase letter equals quantity and the capital equals the quality of the specific commodity in question. Every other commodity now becomes a mirror of wheat's value. Once put into expanded or total form, the use value of a commodity becomes irrelevant and the magnitude of value, determined by socially necessary labor time, becomes the key to exchange. This chain is infinite and ever-changing as productivity changes. As you see, these all have the same exchange value. We can show this in the general form of value. Exchange value exists as a joint contribution of the embodied socially necessary labor time in all commodities. The general form of value is better because it is a simple form, and it is a unified form. Since the form is simple and common to all, that is, 20 yards of linen being common to all, it is general. Therefore, since they express a unification of equivalents abstracted from socially necessary labor time, the general form also expresses the social character of exchange value. This is also a superior model because it shows more than one equivalency, and commodities cannot be of perfect equivalency unless expressed in relation to all other commodities. One can now measure all exchange value in one type of commodity, like linen, but that is not very practical, so most societies settled on gold instead. Once a commodity has been set aside as the pure representative of exchange value, then its relation to other commodities is called the money form of value. Thus we have seen how the simple commodity form X commodity A equals Y commodity B becomes the money form of value, and when minted, whatever price form that will take. Why then, when we see our commodities in daily life, don't we immediately recognize that their exchange values are a result of embodied labor? Perhaps due to the historical circumstances of capitalist society, the values of commodities are usually studied by political economists in their most advanced form, money. These economists see the value of a commodity as something metaphysically autonomous from the social labor that is the actual determinant of value. Marx calls this fetishism, the process whereby the society that originally generated an idea eventually, through the distance of time, forgets that the idea is actually a social and therefore all too human product. This society will no longer look beneath the veneer of the idea, in this case the value of commodities, as it currently exists. The society will simply take the idea as a natural and/or God-given inevitability that they are powerless to alter. Marx compares this fetishism to the manufacturing of religious belief. People initially create a deity to fulfill whatever desire or need they have in present circumstances, but then these products of the human brain appear as autonomous figures endowed with a life of their own and enter into relations both with each other and with the human race. Similarly, commodities only enter into relation with each other through exchange, which is a purely social phenomenon. Before that, they are simply useful items, but not commodities. Value itself cannot come from use value because there is no way to compare the usefulness of an item. There are simply too many potential functions. Once in exchange, commodities' values are determined by the amount of socially useful labor time put into them because labor can be generalized. For example, it takes longer to mine diamonds than it does to dig quartz, so diamonds are worth more. Fetishism within capitalism occurs once labor has been socially divided and centrally coordinated, and the worker no longer owns the means of production. They no longer have access to the knowledge of how much labor went into a product because they no longer control its distribution. The only obvious determinant of value remaining to the mass of people is the value that was assigned in the past. Thus, the value of a commodity seems to arise from a mystical property inherent to it, rather than from labor time, the actual determinant of value.